With Trump's new 90-day tariff pose for all countries except China, is this not a glaring admission of economic incoherence? Why single out China so aggressively when American consumers, from tech to even toilet paper, are deeply dependent on Chinese supply chains? Is this a strategic statecraft or short-term political theater at the cost of global economic stability? What's really going on with Trump's tariff drama? After all the dramatic escalation with 125 or 145% tariffs on China, Trump is suddenly pausing tariffs for 90 days on over 75 countries and lowering those with just 10% the baseline. Is this the art of the deal in action, a strategic retreat, or a sign of deep state pressure? Was China always the primary target, and now the real game in is global trade reset negotiations under U.S. terms? What does it signal about America's real leverage or desperation in today's global trade arena? Ramla Lakshmi says Trump announced tariffs and markets fell by a lot and then posed it on notice. Don't you think this is really market manipulation at its finest? There was a tweet about Trump pausing tariffs way before it was announced. Okay, a lot's happening. A lot is happening, clearly. So, okay, first of all, um, 90-day tariff pause. Why did he pause the tariffs, right? So right now, I believe the tariff percentage on China is 145%. And this is an application of maximum economic pressure. This is bordering on outright economic warfare. Okay. And there's a number of reasons, what number of aims for this. So first, you apply tariffs on everybody. You announce reciprocal tariffs on everybody. You put out a list of what tariff you're applying on what nation, what percentage, right? And China gets a huge tariff. I mean, what tariff rate? 125%. Initially, it was 125%. Okay. So what happens then? That's what was done initially. Tariffs were applied on all nations except for Russia because Russia is already sanctioned. So there's no point. Now, what most nations did is they reached out to the US that, hey, there's no need for this. Let's sit down, let's talk, let us understand your viewpoint, let you understand my viewpoint. Let's try and find a reasonable solution that is good for both sides. There's no need to fight. So most nations had that response to the US. I'm sure our response, India, was the same, right? How did China respond to the tariffs? They applied 84% tariffs back at the US. Then Trump says, White House says, that China has been disrespectful to us. Other nations, they said we want to negotiate, we want to have talks, and we want to find a proper solution. So to all those nations, we are pausing the tariffs for 90 days, 3 months, so that we have time to talk it out and find a solution individually, bilaterally with each nation. 90 days to do that. So only the 10% baseline tariff will remain on all nations, but no extra tariffs for anybody else. But on China, because you guys fought back and put 84% on us, now instead of 125%, it's going to be 145%. And then China has hit back once again and so on. So essentially, this was about isolating and pressuring China. The real target was always China. And you could say that this is economic incoherence or whatever, but I would say maybe it's a planned strategy. Okay. And yeah, you could say that perhaps there was a big pushback in the US because when you put tariffs on all nations, uh, whatever you're importing from across the world becomes shockingly expensive. And that can give rise to inflation, and it can destroy American companies who depend on these imports and so on. So then what you do if that you get the reaction from your domestic voter base, then you pause the tariffs for all countries except China. So you can look at it from different perspectives for sure, right? Is this market manipulation? I think, if the American voter perceives this as market manipulation, Trump is in big trouble. So I don't think it is that. I don't think it's about manipulating markets for personal gain. It's not that. It's about China. It's a geopolitical move. It's a move that is aimed specifically at China. Is this desperation? Look, there is obviously an element of leverage. The ability to impose such incredibly disruptive tariffs It demonstrates the incredibly huge weight, let's say, of the US economy. It demonstrates the US economy's capacity to influence global trade flows and forcing responses across the world, forcing negotiations across the world. Okay. And the fact that the Americans have decided to pause this for 90 days, that itself is an exercise in leverage. We are giving you temporary relief contingent on explicit or implicit future cooperation. Okay. Is there some desperation? um Maybe to some extent there is desperation. This is essentially this nuclear option that they've chosen against China. It could suggest that prior strategies that they employed against China, less aggressive strategies, have now been deemed as insufficient. Okay. And obviously the fact that they've paused the tariffs on most countries, that shows that even for the US there are huge economic costs and political costs. And this entire what you could call a maximalist approach against the whole world is unsustainable politically, economically, etc. Okay. Because this could lead to, for the US, to a tremendous amount of self-sustained economic damage. So yeah, the pause makes sense. The pause that they've used, it definitely makes sense. Now, Pranay talks about the art of the deal. Is this the art of the deal at work? So the art of the deal is a book by Trump. It's an interesting book to read. I would suggest you read it. It's more about negotiation and his style of negotiating, his style of dealing with people, and so on. So that's a framework that Trump uses, the art of the deal framework. So one of the tactics in this framework is you create an extreme opening position, which is this universal set of reciprocal tariffs. You create an extreme opening position, and then you offer concessions. The pause. You offer these concessions so that you can frame your position favorably, to frame your negotiations favorably. So you're maintaining maximum pressure on the real target, which is China, and then you are giving a pause to everybody else. So this is called coercion. You're applying pain while you're also suggesting a path for the to give them relief on my terms. That sort of thing. That's the art of the deal. That's the framework. Yeah, for sure. Now, yeah, the US is dependent on China on so many things. Look, if you have a fortress, if you have a fortress, and that fortress is dependent on goods coming from enemies, then that fortress is in deep trouble. So doesn't make a lot of pressure to doesn't make a lot of sense to keep importing stuff from China, from the US perspective. So why China? Okay. Why why isolate China, and why pressurize China? There are justifications for this. Look, first of all, there is a gigantic trade deficit. We in India talk about the trade deficit with China, don't we? 90 billion dollars or 120, I don't know what the number is, but we have a big trade deficit with China, which works in China's advantage. Obviously it works in China's advantage. When it comes to US China trade, there is a persistent gigantic trade deficit. I think it is about 1.2 trillion dollars in goods. Imagine every year the US is giving 1.2 trillion dollars to China as the trade deficit. My god. Does it make sense to continue to trade with that country? Doesn't make sense. That's one. Then the Americans have been accusing China for a very long time of intellectual property threat, widespread intellectual property threat. I started hearing this for the first time in the early 2000s, 2003 or something. Operation Titan Rain, large scale hacking. They stole blueprints of the F-22 and whatnot, the F-35, which was in its infancy at the time, and all kinds of US military equipment. So intellectual property theft. And the Chinese have these uh, rules for forced technology transfers. So when an American company is setting up shop in China, or whether if they're having things manufactured in China, you have forced technology transfers. Now, obviously, it will disadvantage the United States. Okay, the Chinese give subsidies to their companies. They make it very easy for the companies to operate in China. Unlike in India, in India it's the opposite. But whatever. Okay, um, and the Chinese don't give reciprocal access to Chinese markets to the Americans for American goods. and services. So from that perspective, it makes sense for the Americans to cut off all trade with China. Then there is a national security perspectives. There is this growing perception in the United States that over reliance on China for critical goods is very dangerous. Whether it is pharmacological, pharmaceutical ingredients, whether it is rare earth minerals, whether it is semiconductors, technological components, this is a huge national security vulnerability. You know, if you buy chips from China or you buy some whatever, it may have backdoors. You know, look up what a backdoor is. And some of this became visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we had supply chain disruptions and so on. So the Americans want to reshore vital industries back to the US, make in America, and they want to reduce their dependency on their rival for essential materials and sensitive critical technologies. Because, like I said, a fortress that is supplied by its enemy, it holds the seeds for its own surrender in the future. And then there is geopolitics, okay, because China is the only large scale challenger to the US, and it controls. China seeks to reshape international norms. It seeks to assert its dominance in places like the Indo-Pacific region. It wants to become a technological superpower and leapfrog the US in AI, in 5G, 6G, and so on. So if you put economic pressure on that nation, you're going to constrain that nation's resources and slow its technological progress, its military modernization, and so on. So you want to strategically isolate Beijing and prevent it from forming coalitions to counter American pressure. So you offer different terms to different people. You squeeze China maximally, but you offer a 90-day pause to everybody else. So you're going to fragment the opposition and maximize American leverage in dealings with China, and so on. So that's the big picture that we are looking at. So right now we are in the beginnings of the new Cold War. This is Cold War, clearly. Okay, this is war by other means. This is economic warfare. And during the Cold War of the 20th century, you had economic warfare. So here we are now. The world is changing very, very rapidly.